The subcommittee will come to order. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess of the subcommittee at any time. Without objection, members of the full committee that are not members of the subcommittee are authorized to participate. This hearing is titled Oversight of America's Stock Exchanges, Examining Their Role in Our Economy. This will serve as the formal hearing on 8 bills or discussion drafts that have been circulated to members, and copies of each bill or discussion draft will, without objection, be part of the record of this hearing. I usually thank our witnesses. Today I'm going to thank them profusely because we are going to be interrupted by 8 votes, during which time those of you who are in person, but not those of you who are appearing virtually, will hopefully get some refreshments and otherwise be entertained while myself and my colleagues will be down voting. I now recognize myself for 4 minutes. The U.S. stock exchanges are as old as our nation itself. For over 200 years, they've been a symbol of American capitalism, serving as drivers of economic growth. Since they play such a critical role in our financial system, they've long been recognized as self-regulatory organizations under the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, giving them responsibility for creating regulations that oversee the securities exchanges. For most of the life of the exchanges, they operated as member-owned nonprofit entities. But in the early 2000s, the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, and CBOE, our 3 largest exchanges, transitioned to becoming publicly traded for-profit companies. Over recent years, the SEC has raised concerns about the potential conflicts of interest from acting on the one hand as a quasi-governmental regulatory entity and on the other hand as a for-profit entity. This arises first in the area of selling and providing data. The exchanges sell the basic information, sometimes called the tape, at a modest cost. For a higher cost, they provide proprietary information, which is both delivered more quickly and is more complete. In 2020, the SEC issued rules to reform this system, requiring the public data to be more detailed and allowing basically broker-dealers, the users of the information, to have more voting seats on the NMS boards that oversee these data sales. The exchanges sued and blocked that regulation. One of the bills before us today is the Securities Exchange Reform Act, which would clearly give the SEC the authority to adopt that regulation. We saw with the Facebook offering in 2012, a breakdown of the system. Investors lost as much as $500 million. They were compensated chiefly by broker-dealers, but the exchanges used their authority as SROs to establish rules that capped their liability, and we will explore here whether it is reasonable for them to use their authority as self-regulatory organizations to block or limit the liability, and to what degree they should limit the liability that they incur in operating their for-profit businesses. The exchanges have performed well over the last several years, and these have been difficult years for everyone in our economy. Our hearing will focus on the data providing process of the exchanges and the NMS oversight thereof. We will focus on the liability limitations that they have imposed. We hope also to deal with the governance standards for those stocks listed on exchanges, particularly whether those companies are, for example, overseen in their audits by the PCAOB, something that Chinese companies have refused. In addition to looking at those that are designated as exchanges, We should keep in mind that we had our GameStop hearings, which focused on the recent trading activity taking place off the exchanges, both in the somewhat regulated alternative trading systems and the relatively unregulated dark pools. And of course, an increasing part and a large part of our trading is taking place there. So we look forward to hearing from our witnesses, but first we get an opportunity to hear from the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today's hearing, entitled Oversight of America's Exchanges, Examining Their Role in Our Economy, I unfortunately believe is another example of how off track we have gotten here in this subcommittee and the committee. So why are we here this afternoon? What even prompted this hearing with this timing? Our equity markets have served both investors and businesses, powering economic growth and expanding wealth that has benefited investors, savers, and businesses. But instead, we're focusing on areas that expand opportunities, instead of focusing on areas that expand opportunities for retail investors or promote capital formation for small business, or even the discussion of recent SEC actions, the majority has decided that this is a timely hearing. So in the 117th Congress, this subcommittee has held 5 hearings to date, this being the 6th, and the first one in over 5 months. Since the last time we met as a subcommittee, committee Republicans have highlighted several issues that warrant further attention and oversight. October of 2021, Ranking Member McHenry sent a letter to Chair Gensler asking for clarification on the SEC's authority to regulate the digital asset ecosystem. The subcommittee has taken no action to clarify these statements. November of 2021, Ranking Member McHenry and I called on Chair Waters to join Republicans investigating into the Biden administration's attempt to politicize the PCAOB, the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. To date, committee Democrats have been silent. In December, Congressman French Hill sent a letter to Chair Gensler with several of our colleagues sharing concerns over new, quote, staff guidance on shareholder proposals submitted to publicly traded companies under SEC Rule 14a-8. This guidance comes from staff at the SEC, who have become arbiters of social policy for our financial markets. In January, committee Republicans demanded answers from the SEC, raising serious concerns with Chair Gensler's decision to limit outside input on rulemaking by providing unreasonably short public comment periods, yet these 30-day comment periods continue to be the norm. In February, Congressman Stile and I sent a letter to the SEC regarding proposed changes to the 2020 proxy rule, advisor rule, a rule, by the way, proposed and finalized under former SEC Chairman Clayton that wasn't even allowed to take effect before the proposed amendments were put forth. And finally, just last week, Republican members of this subcommittee sent a letter to Chair Gensler expressing concerns about the upcoming meeting on climate-related disclosure for investors. Of course, Republican concerns were ignored, and the meeting and proposed rule went forward. Time and time again, subcommittee and Democrat leadership have chosen to focus on issues that fail to shine a light on the SEC and their chairman, who's embarking on an aggressive rulemaking agenda, and I might add, leaving us, constitutional players in this whole system, by the roadside. It is unacceptable that we have not had the full commission before the committee in 3 years. I hope Chairman Sherman will see the importance of this hearing, of having all of those commissioners here, and join me in requesting its prioritization. And finally, today, we are having a hearing where no exchange is here to testify. Let me remind you, the hearing is entitled Oversight of America's Exchanges, Examining Their Role in Our Economy. So I'm perplexed why we are having a hearing that does not include the viewpoint from one of the exchanges or all of them, as was proposed by them, is my understanding. I would hope my Democrat colleagues would want to have a productive hearing focused on the issues that matter to American investors and involves all parties involved. So we, as lawmakers, should be working to create an atmosphere that helps promote more capital formation to allow the free flow of capital, strengthen job creation, and increase economic growth. And committee Republicans look forward to discussing how to do that today. But I, again, will note that this is not a fulsome conversation. And I've been assured by at least the participants that they would like to have a fulsome conversation. Well, we are missing some key elements, and I'm not sure what the final outcome that the chair plans with his proposed discussion language and where these bills are going to go, there's a lot more work before there's any kind of markups, and I hope that that is going to be taken into consideration. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you. I'd like to clarify a couple of things about the hearing. The first is this is the Capital Markets Subcommittee, so it seems in order to have a hearing overseeing our capital markets. And any question dealing with our stock exchanges is within the scope of this hearing. The second is the ranking member decries the absence of a representative for the New York Stock Exchange and from NASDAQ. I join with him in that. They both refused to come. We were able to get a representative of the International Exchange Organization.
Mr. Chairman,
Yes?
parliamentary inquiry. Under what time are you taking this to opine about all of this?
The need to clarify the purpose of the hearing so that members understand what questions are in order.
So you'll be, of course, offering equal time then?
If you have comments about which questions are in order, you can bring them
Mr.
up.
Chairman, it just seems that you could deal with that with your time. We know that we have votes. If you'd like to take this time and grant equal time, we can have that debate. This needed to be pointed out.
Sir, in your opening statement, you criticized me for not inviting two relevant witnesses. It is appropriate for me to inform you that those witnesses were invited. I now recognize the chair of the full committee for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Sherman, for holding this hearing. In the United States, there are thousands of companies and exchange-traded funds, that is ETFs, traded on our stock exchanges representing $47 million in market capitalization. Stock exchanges have a dual role of helping businesses raise funds to support their business and creating transparent opportunities for people to invest their funds. Unfortunately, despite being invited to testify, the major exchanges, as the chair has said, the New York Stock Exchange, NASDAQ, and CBOE, are not here today to describe their role in our economy or to help us assess how to reform them. That said, I'm very pleased we are considering, among other reforms, proposals to strengthen corporate governance and limitations on exchange legal immunity. Thank you very much, Chair Sherman.
Now introduce our first witness. We have Professor Robert Jackson, Jr., Professor of Law at New York University School of Law and a former commissioner of the SEC.
Well, thank you, Chairman Sherman, and thank you, Ranking Member Huizenga, for the opportunity to testify about the oversight of the nation's stock exchanges today. For someone like me, our stock exchanges are a symbol of how investing can change the lives of American middle-class families. You see, I was born in the Bronx, New York, to a big Irish Catholic family. My mother's one of 9 kids. My father's one of 5. And the day I was born, none of them had been to college. So my parents plowed their paychecks into the stock market every week, confident that their savings could give their son the chance to go to school. 40 years later, my parents sat behind me at my Senate confirmation hearing to be a commissioner of the Securities and Exchange Commission. So to me, our stock exchanges not only encourage investment and entrepreneurship and growth, they make it possible for 2 middle-class parents to change their son's life. Our stock exchanges are at the core of the American dream, and that's why it's so crucial that our exchanges give investors a level playing field. And that's why today's hearing is so important. You know, when I served as a commissioner, I was fortunate enough to give 2 speeches, one hosted by George Mason University and the Healthy Markets Association, the other by the Open Markets Institute, on what I think is the uniquely American solution to the problems that plague our exchanges: competition. Those institutions are very different ideologically, but they reflect strong bipartisan support for ensuring that exchanges compete like all American businesses should, by adding value, not leveraging their market power and legal status. During my time on the SEC, my office led a series of initiatives designed to achieve just that. Unfortunately, exchanges have responded with litigation and lobbying to stall important progress on these issues. Several of the bills you are considering today would leave no doubt that the SEC has the authority it needs to make our exchanges more than just symbols of competition. Instead, businesses that thrive based on innovation, not litigation. And I'll address 2 issues in those bills shortly. You know, when I first took office at the SEC, I asked our staff to explain a puzzling fact. Even though we had 13 public stock exchanges at the time, 12 of them were owned by just 3 companies. Now, I've worked on mergers acquisitions as an investment banker and a corporate lawyer, so I'm familiar with the economies of scale that justify acquisitions, but I've rarely come across an industry where conglomerates buy and then continue to run identical businesses. So I asked the SEC staff, why are our markets structured this way? And the answer lies in who decides what data investors get on stock prices. We have a 2-tiered system of stock price information in this country, a lower quality public feed and generally higher quality private ones. The key is we allow the exchanges to run them both while profiting from private feeds. The more exchanges a company owns, the more private data feeds they can charge for, even if doing so conflicts with overall market efficiency. As a result, the public feed is slower and less reliable than the private feeds the exchanges sell. That's because exchanges have understandably underinvested in the public feed. It's a product they compete with. As I've said before, it's like letting Barnes & Noble run our public libraries. Nobody should be surprised to find out that our libraries don't have enough books. And as I said, during my tenure, the SEC took 2 key steps to address exchanges' power over stock price data. First, we adopted rules requiring exchanges to upgrade the public feed by including additional information that has become essential to trading in modern markets. Second, we adopted rules requiring the exchanges to propose reforms to the governance of the feeds, so other stakeholders have a say in the quality and price of the information available to investors. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, exchanges responded by suing, exercising the free option our courts have given regulated entities to block changes to market structure. The result is that much of the market structure reforms that we pursued while I was a commissioner still haven't happened. And that's why the Securities Exchange Reform Act of 2022 is so important. Among other things, the act would leave no doubt about the SEC's authority to require exchanges to give stakeholders a say about the pricing and quality of the public feed. The act ensures that Congress, rather than the exchange's lawyers, will determine when these key reforms arrive. The act would also address another vestige of our outdated regulatory structure. Although exchanges are now private profit-making entities, when they're sued, they seek the shield of government immunity. Generally, market participants expect to be held liable for the harm that they cause, and this expectation gives them incentives to take care when dealing with others. Government actors, by contrast, are usually held harmless from liability, so that their decisions reflect optimal policy. Exchanges claim that they're regulatory entities, so they should be immune from liability when their profit-maximizing decisions harm investors. Now, back when I was a corporate lawyer, that was a better argument. Back then, exchanges actually developed meaningful corporate governance rules that gave investors a chance to hold insiders accountable. But today, exchanges' profit motive leads them to pursue listings, not investor protection. And since exchanges have exited the business of corporate governance, they can't have it both ways, pursuing profit when it suits them and the shield of regulatory immunity when it doesn't. We've learned through hard experience that extending the government's protections to profit-making actors gives them reason to take excessive risks since they privatize gains from their actions but don't bear the losses. Moreover, exchange rulebooks impose low liability limits, even when exchanges are found liable for investor losses. Both of these are inconsistent with the accountability we see in truly competitive markets, and both put investors at risk of losses from decisions that are shielded.
Professor, your time has expired. Perhaps one more sentence to summarize.
Of course. Let me just say that while it's understandable that market participants seek legal advantage where they can, we owe it to investors like my mom and dad to give them confidence that the biggest participants in our markets compete on a level playing field. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify today.
Witnesses are reminded that the oral testimony should be limited to 5 minutes. You should be able to see the timer that will indicate how much time you have left. Without objection, all the witnesses' written statements will be made part of the record. It is the chair's intention to hear from 2 more witnesses and then adjourn so that we can vote. We'll now hear from Mr. Michael Piwowar, who is the...
Piwowar.
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 I'll do my best.
There you go.
Thank you for correcting me. Who is the Executive Director of the Milken Institute for Financial Markets and a former Commissioner and Acting Chairman of the SEC.
Yeah, thank you, Chairman Sherman. You can just call me Mike. It's easier to pronounce than my last name. And thank you for inviting me here today, Ranking Member Huizenga and members of the subcommittee. It's great to see you, many of you in person. It's great to see so many familiar faces in person today. For those of you that don't know me, as Chairman Sherman mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of the Milken Institute Center for Financial Markets. Over the course of my career, most relevant to today's hearing, I spent 9 years serving at the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission. Earlier, I spent 4 years there as a visiting academic scholar. and a senior financial economist. More recently, I had a 5-year term as commissioner and also served as acting chairman. During my SEC tenure, I always appreciated the thoughtful work of this subcommittee to help ensure that the SEC remained focused on its noble mission so that capital markets work and make sure that they work as well for everyone. You know, the U.S. capital markets are the envy of the world due in large part to the role that our stock exchanges play. America's stock exchanges list the thousands of public companies that millions of Americans invest in. They trade literally billions of shares every single day, representing more than trillions of dollars every single year. As this subcommittee evaluates various legislative proposals to change regulatory policies affecting U.S. stock exchanges, my written testimony contains details that I won't cover now, but I thought I would mention 2 broad areas. One is guiding principles that I use when thinking about general market structure policy, and then also some comments on some of the specific policy proposals listed for this hearing. I'm happy to provide more information about any of them during today's hearing. Our capital markets help make America's future bright for everyone. For some, that future is to take their entrepreneurial spirit and put it into action. Take a risk, start a company, raise capital from investors, hire workers, and bring a product or service to market, thereby improving the standards of living of the customers they serve, the employees they hire, and the investors who share in their success. For others, that future is to take their hard-earned savings and invest in the job-creating entrepreneurs, and to take the proceeds from those investments and provide for retirement and security, investments in their children's education, and then reinvest some of those proceeds into other job-creating entrepreneurs in their community and throughout our great nation. So when it's all said and done, our capital markets help all Americans invest in America's future by investing in each other. Mr. Chairman, thank you for bringing attention to the critical role that exchanges play in our capital markets, our economy, and America's future. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify here today. I look forward to answering all of the questions that you and your colleagues have.
Thank you for your brevity. We now move to Ms. Ellen Greene, who is Managing Director at Sifma, the Securities Industry and Financial Markets Association. Microphone, please. Please turn on your microphone.
Chair Sherman and Waters, ranking members Huizenga and McHenry, and distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today on behalf of the Securities Industry and Financial Markets Association. I commend you for bringing transparency to the urgent need to modernize the self-regulatory system underpinning the U.S. equity markets. Sifma is the leading trade association for broker-dealers, investment banks, and asset managers. Our members' combined businesses represent 75% of the U.S. broker-dealer sector by revenue and 50% of the asset management sector by assets under management. It is an honor to testify on behalf of our industry's 1 million employees and the hundreds of millions of Americans they serve whose retirement, education, and personal savings are invested in the capital markets. This puts me in the privileged position of being the only witness today who represents communities in every district served by members of this subcommittee. The former school teacher whose pension allows her to retire comfortably, the working parents saving to send their kids to college, the recent graduate who invests a portion of her paycheck each month, and many more like them. Those are your constituents, they're our clients, and it is the financial future that should be our focus for today's discussion. Our equity markets facilitate the capital formation that is the lifeblood of our economy. Government's primary objective is to protect the interests of the investing public. Most securities laws meet that standard, but there are features of the self-regulatory system that fall short and need to be updated. In the Securities Exchange Act of 1934, Congress codified exchanges as self-regulatory organizations known as SROs. As such, each exchange is required to enforce compliance with both its own trading rules and federal securities laws. This includes the power to examine, investigate, and bring disciplinary actions against broker-dealers. This system made sense in 1934 when exchanges were organized as nonprofit cooperatives owned by their broker-dealer members who operated them like utilities. But starting in the early 2000s, Americans' exchanges became for-profit entities, and many are part of publicly traded companies. Driven by their duty to maximize profits, exchanges now sell market data and other products to broker-dealers who compete against them for order flow and execution services. In other words, the institutions upon which our self-regulatory system was built no longer exist. Like other for-profit companies, exchanges act in the best interest of their shareholders, but there is a fundamental conflict of interest between that duty and their regulatory duties to protect the interests of the investing public. This conflict is made worse by special privileges granted to the exchanges prior to them becoming for-profit entities. For example, exchanges have historically been exempted by courts from private liability for damages they cause while performing their regulatory duties, but have sought to expand this immunity to damages caused while acting as for-profit entities. Exchanges also impose non-negotiable, unreasonably low limitations on their private liability for damages they cause. In fact, the exchanges try to impose a $500 limitation of liability on broker-dealers in the event of a cyber breach of the Consolidated Audit Trail, known as CAT. Exchanges have the unique right to sell their data products and monopolistic power to set their prices, while broker-dealers and others are captive customers with no alternatives. Exchanges exclude their competitors from fully participating in, but require them to comply with and help finance major initiatives developed as NMS plans. And exchanges overlapping regulatory jurisdictions give them access to broker-dealers' highly valuable trading data through their access to CAT. In sum, the powers that for-profit exchanges have to regulate and set the costs for their customers and competitors make our equity markets less fair, competitive, efficient, transparent, and inclusive. This harms the investing public. My written testimony discusses 5 reforms targeted at these unfair privileges. Enacting them will modernize our self-regulatory system and make our equity markets fairer and more efficient. They offer a rare chance for bipartisan cooperation to serve the interests of individual investors. We stand ready to work with anyone who shares this goal. We have a unique opportunity to make a positive difference in the lives of hundreds of Americans in every state and congressional district in the country whose financial futures are invested in the capital markets. We should not let it pass. Thank you, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. The chair notes that over 300 members have yet to vote, and accordingly, we will recognize at least one more witness. We have Nandini Sukumar, who is CEO of the World Federation of Exchanges, and our one witness who's willing to come before us representing the exchanges both here in the United States and elsewhere.
Good afternoon, Chairman and Ranking Member Huizenga and members of the subcommittee. It's a pleasure to be here and happy to do it anytime. We represent not only U.S. exchanges, but exchanges around the world. Our U.S. members have a storied history with the WFE. We're an old trade association founded in 1961. So U.S. exchanges here today have indeed been active participants engaged in leadership roles across the world in the world of exchanges. As I've mentioned, the WFE is the global trade body for regulated exchanges and clearinghouses. Since the beginning, we have focused on improving markets. We now represent over 300 pieces of market infrastructure, exchanges and CCPs. All of them are highly regulated businesses. As a preliminary point, I'd like to note that exchanges work hard, very hard, to ensure robust infrastructure, including cybersecurity and operational resilience more generally. They demonstrated this extensively through one of the most testing times for financial markets during the pandemic, of course, a period when broker-dealers, by contrast, very clearly faced operational difficulties. In all cases, WFE member exchanges fulfill a function that we see as critical to capital markets: price formation. Without clear, unbiased, authoritative, and up-to-the-minute information about the ever-changing value of financial assets, markets would simply struggle to serve society. This is why it is one of the key criterion of membership of the WFE that an exchange performs such a role, ensuring a properly structured setting for establishing the consensus price of financial assets at any given moment. At the same time, the modern exchange has to be a dynamic and competitive business, constantly investing in new capacity in order to meet the ever-increasing demands of investors, of issuers of securities, and of financial service companies globally. The exchange, therefore, performs a valuable role from which financial service intermediaries benefit. They benefit particularly greatly, and which has broader public benefits serving the businesses that need capital to grow and the investors whose savings can be put to work. So our members have many things in common. But the deeper, more fundamental shared characteristic is that they are at the core of capital markets in their respective jurisdictions. Supporting fair and transparent trading is their purpose, and in our view, an essential component of public trust in the financial system. Our members recognize that the central role has always come with significant responsibility and will continue to do so. There are many ways in which this responsibility manifests itself, including setting the rules for who can participate and how, ensuring surveillance of the trading process, and overseeing everything from listing requirements to trading halls to stock splits. These functions relating to the operation and oversight of their markets are highly regulated and complex and are all conducted in furtherance of fair and orderly markets and protection of investors. I want to stress that the exchange really creates the marketplace and the flow of price information, but it does not participate in it. In other words, the great strength of the exchange model is that they act as an impartial facilitator of business, ensuring that transactions can take place in a safe and efficient manner while staying at arm's length from the back and forth that characterize the typical trading day. This is a very important distinction, and just as importantly, it applies whatever the ownership and governance structure of the exchange. The very nature of the exchange role is to be a trusted third party that must fulfill considerable statutory obligations every single day. The US securities exchanges are not only very highly regulated, but incredibly transparent. All rules and charges are filed with the SEC and publicly available, something that cannot be said for many other entities in capital markets. I started by talking about the exchange business being modern in outlook, but it is built on well-established principles, much longer than the WFE's own history. It is a blend of these well-established principles and state-of-the-art operations that makes exchanges so effective for the full range of market participants, including everyday investors, as well as Wall Street. In summary, exchanges take their role and responsibility seriously because this is what makes them effective and valuable. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm now going to recognize our fifth witness with the warning that if we get down to only 70 not voting, I may ask you to suspend. We have with us Manisha Kimmel, who is the Chief Policy Officer of MayStreet.
You take the mic down and point the mic at your mouth.
Okay, let's try it again. Thank you for holding this hearing and offering me the opportunity to appear before you today. My name is Manisha Kimmel. I am the Chief Policy Officer at MayStreet, and throughout my 25-year career, I have worked at the intersection of regulation and technology. At MayStreet, I focus on the policy issues that impact market data and our business model. MayStreet is a fast-growing fintech. Our software processes market data from hundreds of trading venues across multiple asset classes worldwide. Market data from the U.S. stock exchanges is a big part of what we do. We are active in market structure through our comment letters and membership in industry associations, including Healthy Markets Association and the Financial Information Forum. I look forward to offering our view on the important role American exchanges play in our capital markets and on how Congress can improve oversight of the national market system. The exchange world has changed. I'd like to highlight a few of these changes. First, the major exchanges are now publicly traded companies. Second, broker-dealers are not just customers of the exchanges, they're competitors to them. Third, exchanges sell their raw data and package it into a number of products. The sale of their own data, as well as their allocation of sales from the public market data stream, are significant sources of revenue. Fourth, exchanges seek to innovate in terms of order types, product offerings, and pricing models, and to support those business decisions, the exchanges filed over 1,300 rules in 2021 alone. Over 700 of those were immediately effective. Compare that to 20 years ago, when exchange filings numbered in the dozens. In light of these market dynamics, we believe this subcommittee should take action in the following areas. Our first recommendation is that Congress give the SEC direct control over the public market data stream. Industry and investor groups have raised concerns that the current NMS plan structure that administers the public data stream is not serving investors. The SEC has tried to address these concerns through recent rules, specifically the CT plan and the Market Data Infrastructure Rule, also known as the MDI Rule. The CT plan, among other things, includes the industry and investors as voting members of the governance of the NMS plan. The MDI rule would expand the content of the public data stream and bring competition to its production and distribution. Both of these rules are tied up in litigation between the SEC and major exchanges. This conflict calls into question the value of operating the public data streams as NMS plans. Why? Because there is a fundamental misalignment of interests. On the one hand, the congressional mandate to ensure timely access to core market data at a reasonable price, and on the other hand, the commercial interests of the major exchanges seeking to maintain revenue, the over $400 million in revenue from the public market data stream, and revenues associated with the exchange's own data products that directly compete with that public data stream. While adding investors and brokers to the NMS plan governance is a step in the right direction, we believe that Congress should go further and give the Commission control of the public market data stream. Our second recommendation is that Congress eliminate immediately effective exchange fee filings. Subjecting exchange fee filings to notice and comment would mean that fee changes cannot be retroactive, nor can they be effective until after the SEC reviews and approves. Exchange fees matter to investors because they directly affect order routing decisions and the ability of broker-dealers to achieve best execution for their customers. Market participants should be given a voice in how and when fee changes go into effect. To that end, MayStreet supports the discussion draft legislation posted in connection with today's hearings that would amend the Exchange Act to modernize the filing and approval requirements for these fee filings. Specifically, by requiring exchange fee filings to go through the regular Commission review and approval process, the proposed legislation will allow the SEC to discharge its statutory duty to affirm the Exchange Act standards are met, namely that exchange files are reasonable, equitably allocated, not unduly burdensome, and not discriminatory. Our third recommendation is that Congress create a clear mechanism for the SEC to review and remand filings already on the books. The SEC attempted to summarily remand over 400 filings for review. Unfortunately, the SEC's efforts were overturned by the courts, so Congress should step in. Investors and others should not continue to pay fees that are inappropriate given the application of the Exchange Act standard in today's environments. Our fourth recommendation is that Congress and the SEC provide definitive guidance on the Exchange Act standard as it relates to exchange fee filings. While Congress has explicitly declared that exchange fees need to meet Exchange Act standards, it has not defined what that means. Having the exchanges and commission on the same page helps investors because when you set expectations properly, the process is less time-consuming and more consistent. Thank you for your consideration of our recommendations and for the opportunity to share my thoughts on these important topics.
Thank you for your testimony. The committee will now stand in recess, and we will reconvene immediately following the conclusion of this series of votes. Subcommittee is back in session. I recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. Ms. Greene, in your written testimony, you highlight that when NASDAQ was sued by market participants for mishandling Facebook's 2012 IPO, the exchange argued that it was immune from liability because it was also an SRO. However, handling the Facebook IPO is something they did in their proprietary capacity, and in fact, they charged for it. My discussion draft, the Securities Exchange Reform Act, which has been noticed for this hearing, would clarify that exchanges are shielded by immunity only when carrying out their regulatory functions. Could you speak to how a clarification of this standard would help market participants?
Certainly. A clarification of this standard would help clarify some of the judicial standings that we have today, where exchanges have historically been exempted by courts from private liability for damages they cause while performing their regulatory duties, but have sought to expand this for damages caused while acting as for-profit entities. And making changes to this and having the exchanges be responsible for damages that are caused when they're acting in a for-profit capacity, we think is important, because we do see them increasingly hiding behind their regulatory shield, and that was adopted back in 1934 in the Exchange Act. And certainly we've seen a lot of evolution in the exchanges in the early 2000s to for-profit companies. So it seems that some of these special privileges that they enjoy today really need to be addressed through some of the legislation that's been put forth, so that they're more similar to other publicly traded companies that don't enjoy immunity from commercial activities, and also looking at things like limitation of liability, prohibiting the exchanges from setting artificially low caps, so that when there are incidents like Facebook, there is adequate funding or the ability to sue them in court, so that there's able to be compensation to cover investor losses.
I'd point out that my discussion draft provides that there would be, or allows for, some cap, with the intention that we would set that cap at a level where the exchanges could get insurance. The goal here is not to endanger them, even if there should be something like what happened with Facebook, which some have said was a $500 million item, but rather to make sure that we put liability where the negligence resides. Ms. Kimmel, as you know, the data is the lifeblood of all financial markets. Through their control of the NMS, National Market System plans, which govern the collection, aggregation, and distribution of public stock market data, the exchanges have control over what investors rely on, that data, in their market trading decisions. They have the, quote, public data, the tape, which is provided for one price, but then they simultaneously sell separate proprietary data to market participants, which is more detailed, delivered more quickly than the public market data. Would you agree this creates a disincentive for the exchanges to improve the quality of the tape, the market public data, when they have a competing product that sells for more?
I think it absolutely does. But just to explain it, the exchanges actually sell two types of proprietary feeds. One are the top-of-book feeds, and the other are the depth feeds. So the depth feeds are the ones that you're talking about that are more expensive, have lower latency, and every order of data. But it's important to understand that this top-of-book data they sell is less expensive, has less data, and is chosen by retail broker-dealers instead of the consolidated tape because of those reasons. And so for that, because of that, we think it's very important that this market data infrastructure rule proceed, which would expand the content on the tape.
In my remaining seconds, I would note that roughly 44% of stock trades happen off the exchanges, 70% of that with Citadel and Virtue. And I'm going to ask Professor Jackson for comments on the record regarding that, as my time has expired, and I now recognize the ranking member.
Mr. Chairman, before I ask my questions, I ask unanimous consent that the testimony of Kevin Edgar on behalf of the Equity Markets Association be entered into the record.
Without objection.
Thank you. Ms. Greene, it's my understanding this is your first time testifying in front of Congress. Well, welcome to the circus. I won't ask you to identify the clowns, but we try to be productive here. So, yeah, that's look in a mirror every day, right? So, I wanted to take a moment to discuss Consolidated Audit Trail. This is something that we've discussed before. Currently, the SEC has it before it, and because I believe that this is an issue that is important for everyone represented in the room, I just wanted to touch on that. Frankly, it's been an issue we've been discussing for quite a while. In fact, in 2017, when I chaired this subcommittee, we had a hearing on that topic, and at the time, I discussed a proposal I had introduced that meant to safeguard and govern the security of the information reported to and stored by and accessed by the Consolidated Audit Trail. Fast forward to August of 2020, the SEC proposed amendments to the National Market System Plan governing the Consolidated Audit Trail to bolster its data security. I think it's important to remember that the CAT will be the largest database of customer and institutional trading data ever created and will include a lot of very sensitive information, to say the least. So given this, I think it's imperative for all market participants that the SEC get this right. They have to have confidence of investors that their information is going to be safe and will not be at risk of a data breach. Would you mind sharing your perspective on one, the SEC getting it right, and two, the SEC moving quickly to approve the proposal?
Yes, of course. Thank you. While Sifma remains in full support of the CAT, we do agree with you that there remain a lot of data security issues and privacy concerns that haven't been addressed to this day. Certainly, the SEC proposal that was put forth by former Chair Clayton was something that Sifma supported. We did have minor modifications to it, yet we thought that the Commission's concept of keeping the data within CAT in a secure environment that they could work on was a big improvement to having them download the data out of CAT. And in fact, we saw many of the exchanges file comment letters opposing that proposal and their ability to take data out of the CAT. When we do look at CAT, we really think that a breach is more of a when than if an if. And again, we continue.
And in fact has happened.
Yes, it has, yes. And, you know, as I said, we continue to raise this issue with FINRA-CAT, the SROs, the SEC, as well as yourself. And we were very supportive of your legislation back in 2018, Congressman Huizenga, and we think that the American Customer Information Protection Act would prohibit the collection of personally identifiable information was something that was very important. Sifma did work with the SROs to keep Social Security numbers out of CAT, but we do remain concerned about that data and think those changes are really long overdue.
All right, I appreciate that. I have a minute and a half, and we can continue this discussion about how fast the SEC is moving or not. Mr. Piwowar, you're former commissioner as well as acting chair. Lots of concern, at least on this side of the aisle, about the impact of the short comment periods that the SEC is giving market participants. Could you touch on that very quickly? And then, somewhat related to that, SEC's own admission, there's the economic consequences and potential negative unintended consequences that are there. SEC's climate-related disclosures is estimated to cost $10.2 billion in paperwork burden alone, and some estimates have it at greater than that. So if you could couple those things, short comment periods and dramatic, huge moves like that coming out of the SEC.
No, that's absolutely right. I mean, when I was on the commission, I was an advocate for 90-day comment periods. The longer, the better. Some people think it's a way to sort of keep out special interests from weighing into the comment period. It has the opposite effect. There's so many different, the folks, the trade associations, they can hire lawyers to do this. It's everyday Americans that don't have time to read through these huge, long proposals. The climate proposals, more than 500 pages. And the other thing is that there's so many proposals out at the same time, right? It's not that you have 30 days to
They're
read
just flooding the zone at this point.
flooding the zone, and Chairman Gensler is very smart, and he's run an agency before, and when he was at the CFTC, was very famous for putting something very important into footnote 513 on a cross-border rule. So folks have to read these rules very, very carefully and need the time to do that.
My time has expired. Appreciate it.
Without objection, I'd like to submit for the record a statement from Fidelity Investments and letters sent to the committee for this hearing from OTC Markets, American Securities Association, Insured Retirement Institute, and Public Citizen. And with that, I recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Cast.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses. I want to talk about something that, or ask questions on something that is off the topic here, but certainly top of news, and Russian money laundering. And this is as much just sort of background for me, because I feel like as a member of this committee, I should be smarter on this issue than I am. 2017, there was the whole Deutsche Bank mirror trade scandal with folks buying on a Russian market of a dual-listed security and then selling on a London market and converting essentially, Russian assets into hard currency. And I guess I want to start with you, Mr. Jackson. Just walk me through, if you can, from an exchange perspective, if you have the same party or a related party executing the same trade on two different markets that are obviously connected, do you, as the U.S. exchange, as a U.S. domiciled exchange, have any obligation? Do you have the data? Do you have any monitoring of that trade? Or is the only compliance on the trader in a Deutsche Bank? And I realize this was 2017, so it's a lifetime ago in Russian money laundering. But I just want to understand what you're monitoring right now, and are we satisfied that that barn door is closed?
Well, thank you, Congressman, and I think it's a crucial issue you've raised. Certainly, I share the concern about the degree to which foreign money finds itself into U.S. companies and exchanges. I think on this front, the exchanges have done very well to collaborate internationally with exchanges all around the world about the flow of funds into various kinds of companies. But Congressman, I do want to highlight a concern about this. You might know that Congress just last year unanimously passed what I think is a very important statute, the Holding Foreign Companies Accountable Act, which requires delisting of firms, particularly those from China, that refuse to have auditors' books inspected. And to me, audit inspection of a company's books is the basic lifeblood. It's the most basic rule of the road that we have in American capital markets. And a question that someone could ask, sir, and a question that I'd like to ask, is why was it necessary for Congress to pass a law letting exchanges know that they shouldn't be listing companies that refuse to have their books inspected? Here, too, I would think that the exchanges, if they were going to take their regulatory role more seriously, would not require a federal law to be more careful about the kinds of companies that Americans are investing in. So I do think the concerns you've raised are quite serious. The exchanges face a serious problem, a serious challenge there, and they've done important and very hard work on questions around money laundering and foreign investment, but I think we have a long way to go.
Okay, Ms. Sukumar, same question for you, but from your vantage point of seeing a lot of different international markets that are all in somewhat different regulatory regimes, are there, and I want to frame this question by saying if your answer to this question is we should talk off the record, that's fine. But are there gaps in regulatory structures between the reporting structures, the compliance between these markets, so that if you had a dual-listed security, maybe I can't go straight from Russia to London anymore, but are there other international markets? Are there areas where you're concerned about so that we can ensure that we're not using our markets to launder money?
Thank you very much for the question and the opportunity. I would start by saying that every exchange in the world, every public market in the world is incredibly focused on ensuring that there's integrity of their markets. So money laundering is a key concern. I think that every exchange, not just in America, but across the world, shares that focus, shares that drive, shares that vision really of having, clean money and stringent standards across markets globally. Two things really at this point to offer you. One, that every member of the WFE has to pass membership criteria. So we do a kind of assessment, and a really important membership criteria for us is, do the members comply or conform? Do they recognize international money laundering standards? And the answer is a resounding yes. And the second is that among our membership criteria, we have almost the first rule is where we look at regulatory jurisdiction, and we say, is your regulator a member of the International Regulatory Association, IOSCO? And the reason that's particularly important is because regulators internationally have an MOU, so they sign this agreement where there is information sharing that helps them crack down on international crime. So I would say to you, it's obviously a complex topic. It's obviously a topic that worries everyone. And I think the exchanges have been doing a remarkable job about keeping markets clean. It helps, of course, that in their DNA, exchanges are transparent markets, right? We live by corporate disclosure. Thank you. I see I'm out of time.
Yeah, no, and I'm out of time, and I guess I'll just leave that I still don't understand whether this was Deutsche Bank that was not reporting information that the exchanges should have had access to, or whether the exchanges weren't monitoring that information. And I'd be happy to continue with any of you offline should you have more to share. Yield back.
Thank you. We now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Davidson.
Thank the chairman. I thank our witnesses and appreciate the chance to talk to you about this. Frankly, Ms. Kimmel, when I heard your testimony, there's a lot of things I would love to go into, but we have a hard time in the minority picking topics for hearings. So I'm going to stretch some of the experience that you've had, and Mr. Piwowar, in particular, with your time at the SEC, while this hearing discusses regulatory proposals to enhance our current market structure, I'd like to focus for a second on what we have learned from our existing structure and how that can help us craft a framework for the future with respect to crypto exchanges. It's inevitable that crypto exchanges will continue to expand and become accepted over the course of the next few years. We can probably all agree that they will need to be regulated by someone, and an inherent part of that regulation will include an adequate disclosure regime like we have in place today with respect to equity markets. In your testimony, Mr. Piwowar, you do a good job of laying out guiding principles for market structure for traditional equities markets. In your opinion, what are some of the principles or perhaps some of the aspects of Reg NMS that we could emulate for a future crypto exchange framework?
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. I mean, the first thing to recognize is that the U.S. equity markets are very complex, right? As has been mentioned here, it's not just exchanges, there's market makers, and there's alternative trading systems and the like. We have the same thing in the crypto world. We have exchanges, we have wallets, we have all kinds of different things. And so to recognize that this is a dynamic and changing environment, and you want to set down the rules of the road so you sort of balance the two pieces of the sort of two of the three parts of the SEC's mission. On the one hand, you want to protect investors, but on the other hand, you want to facilitate capital formation and innovation. And the key is getting that right. And the way you do that is through economic analysis, cost-benefit analysis, and then continuing to look at it over time to see whether or not we need to make changes over time based upon when markets change and when technologies change.
Are long drawn-out enforcement actions selectively applied effective, or is a clear rulemaking process more effective?
Yeah, clear rulemaking, obviously, right? Throughout my entire term, I was, against rulemaking by enforcement. It's not fair to the people who aren't parties to the enforcement action. Oftentimes, you have a settlement that's entered into by one party and the commission, and then there's undertakings in that become de facto rulemaking that were not put out for notice and comment, that were not put out for other people to weigh in on, and now that becomes de facto rulemaking that they have to comply with.
And investors are hurt when that happens, correct?
That's correct.
Yeah, and I think, look, it becomes incumbent upon Congress at some point to really provide that clarity, and not just for the investors, but for the innovators and, frankly, for the regulators, because then there's a bright line, you're on this side of it or that side of it. And if I shift, Ms. Sukumar, on a similar note, how do you think we could effectively build a framework that prevents market fragmentation and promotes transparency? Obviously, the crypto market has inherent differences, such as a global reach. I mean, 75 to 90% of the liquidity is offshore. It runs 24/7. But here in the United States, how can we entice future exchanges to build their presence here in the United States versus offshore?
And thank you, Congressman. That's a great question. The crypto, I think, continues to preoccupy us all, partly because we do want that innovation to occur. But I would also say to you, innovation isn't innovation if it's breaking the rules. So we've had a question on Russia, and I'm really thinking, I wake up every morning and there's a headline about how, crypto platforms, because very few, I can't think of any that are registered as exchanges, as licensed exchanges, crypto platforms saying we're not going to follow sanctions dictates. So I think really what would be incredibly helpful in thinking about crypto, because crypto is an asset class. It needs to be traded in a way the retail investor is involved.
Yeah, well, let me interrupt you there for a second, because if you're asking for an exchange to do something that has know your customer provisions and something, that's a different question. If you're asking for something like, a node to be able to do it, you don't even know the identity of who owns which wallet. And frankly, you can't do that and not try to kill the entire concept. So I think there are a lot of people that don't really actually understand the space, which is a barrier to creating regulatory clarity. I do hope that we can have future hearings where we deal with these topics, because we touch on a lot of topics with repetition.
The time of the gentleman has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. Mooney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. SEC Chairman Gary Gensler assumed office on April 17th, 2021. So we're approaching the one-year anniversary of Mr. Gensler's tenure. Already I have some concerns about the direction of the commission under Mr. Gensler's leadership. Mr. Piwowar, you spent 5 years on the commission, and you know the way it functions as well as anyone. So Mr. Piwowar, in your testimony today, you wrote at length about pilot studies as a tool for the commission to measure and test the impact of changes in policy before implementation. Can you further elaborate on the pilot studies and how they've helped the commission avoid bad policy changes in the past?
Yes, thank you for your question. I am a big proponent of pilot studies. At the same time, I recognize there's limitations and we need to put some guardrails around them. So, one of the examples of a successful pilot study was the tick size pilot program that the SEC did. Also, Reg Show pilot, got rid of short sale restrictions. The tick size pilot, there were proponents for a long time said if we increase the tick size for small cap securities, it would improve liquidity. Some people thought that it would, increase analyst coverage. We did that pilot, and it showed that neither one of those happened. It wasn't a success in that it didn't. It's not that it wasn't a success because it didn't help small cap companies, but it allowed us to sort of say, all right, that's not a problem. We can move on and look at other things to help improve the liquidity there. In terms of limitations, I recognize that pilot studies can be costly for market participants to implement, so the SEC needs to do a robust cost-benefit analysis to make sure that it is proper. On that note, I will note that some pilot studies, like the tick size pilot, were done through an NMS plan, and I know that NMS plans are a large part of this hearing. I would prefer that pilot studies be done through notice and comment rulemaking, so that everyone has a chance to weigh in and can say what they believe in terms of the costs and the benefits of any particular pilot program.
Thank you. I have a general concern about the administration, all levels of government, making law, which is the rule of Congress, not administration. But at least if you're going to issue new rules and regulations, I think a pilot study and being cautious would make sense.
And one thing, if I may, one of the unfortunate things that came out of, the access fee pilot was challenged in court, and the D.C. Circuit said in there that the SEC did not have the authority to conduct a pilot study. And I think what would be helpful, a great role for this committee, if I may, would be to clarify that the commission does in fact have authority to engage in pilot studies, and maybe also put some guardrails around that, where it should be done through notice and comment rulemaking rather through an NMS plan.
Thank you. We'll look into that. So second question, capital formation is a core part of the SEC three-part mission, yet the commission's current agenda does not include any capital formation proposals. So Mr. Piwowar, can you speak to the importance of reducing burdens for companies seeking access to capital?
Yes, as a matter of fact, next week is the 10th anniversary of the hugely bipartisan Jobs Act. It was probably the most successful piece of bipartisan legislation during the Obama administration. And what we saw there was that if you can do some tweaks around the edges, lessening some of the burden for companies going public, the IPO on-ramp was probably the most successful provision in that legislation, is that works. And so, I would encourage this committee and the commission to keep looking at what are some new ideas, 10 years later, that we can continue to do while protecting investors, but to improve the formation of capital.
Fair enough. And I'm just make some closing comments in the minute I have left, but I'm concerned that the commission's current leadership seems more interested in regulating broadly and asking questions later. Gensler has repeatedly said that digital assets are securities. Conveniently for Mr. Gensler, that legal interpretation could give the SEC broader authority to regulate the entire industry. On the issue of climate disclosure, the SEC has decided to play the role of social activist by requiring that Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions be disclosed by all public companies, whether or not those emissions are material to investors. So regardless of whether they're sought by the average investor, the SEC has decided that public issuers must provide them. It's not at all clear how this climate requirement fits within the three pillars of the SEC's mission, which is protecting investors, maintaining fair, orderly, and efficient markets, or facilitating capital formation. Yet, Gensler has prioritized his climate agenda over making his agenda item over making any single rule related to capital formation. So unfortunately, I feel the Commission's current leadership is not adhering to the restrained, measured approach that characterizes good government. And I wish he would look more carefully at your testimony instead of pursuing the priorities of climate change activists. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Those watching the hearing will notice that we don't have as many members as usual. They should be aware that there's now a classified briefing regarding Ukraine going on, and members had a tough decision. The gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Gonzalez, is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses. Let me start by thanking you and Chairwoman Waters for attaching the Bipartisan Registration for Index-Linked Annuities Act that I introduced with my friend Alma Adams. It's my hope that this committee can advance this common sense legislation in the coming weeks, has strong support of members on both sides of the aisle. Look forward to debating that, hopefully coming soon. Mr. Piwowar, I want to start specifically with you. You mentioned the Jobs Act, 10-year anniversary. I know you're very familiar with it. I want to give you some time to maybe comment on areas that you think we can go further to improve that IPO on-ramp, make sure that there's more companies coming public, and they can do so in an efficient manner. Would love any of your thoughts on that.
Sure, I have some. I see Congressman Emmers here, but I'm sure we're going to get into his venture exchange bill a little bit later. I think that could be a nice piece of the puzzle. What the Jobs Act showed was that, that we can make some differences around the edges. What it also showed was that there were a number of provisions in the Jobs Act that a lot of people ahead of time, ex ante, thought were going to be taken up and be used, and they weren't. But other ones we didn't realize were going to be as important as they ended up to be. So, for example, the ability of companies to do confidential filings with the SEC has proven to be a huge success. It allows companies to go through that process. If they decide not to go through with the offering, it's not like there's some sort of stain on the company or whatever. Yeah. It allows biotech companies really like that idea because it allows them to keep proprietary information from their competitors, but then that information becomes public and enough time for investors to move forward. So, just as a general matter, I would encourage this subcommittee and the committee at large and Congress to come up with as many different ideas as possible because we don't know which ones are going to be used. Now, having said that, I think there's, venture exchanges are one potential way to go forward, that there's other sort of things you could do in that area. The other one is, I think opening up the accredited investor definition and to allow more investment in private companies is something, that we could do. And then, just anything in the IPO on-ramp, if there's other types of burdens and regulations to take a look at, 10 years later, are there new things now that are burdening companies? I mean, I'm fond of, there's what's called the pebbles in the stream analogy in terms of regulatory accumulation. The commission does a good job at looking at, on an individual basis, cost-benefit analysis, but over time, those regulatory burdens can go over time, and they're like pebbles in a stream, where each individual pebble doesn't stop the flow of the stream, but cumulatively they can, and you can't look back and say it was any one of those. And so I'd encourage folks to look back and say, well, what has accumulated over the last 10 years that could potentially be scaled back for these smaller emerging growth companies?
Yeah, I think the accredited investor rule in particular, just by definition, shuts out so many Americans. And we know that the bulk of the returns, or a lot of the returns of our fastest growing companies are now happening in private markets. So we're shutting out, we're excluding minorities, we're excluding lower income retail investors from being able to get involved at the ground level at some of these exciting companies. I think it's a horrible rule. I would love to see bipartisan support around coming up with something more sensible. Sure, we have to protect folks, but good God, let's give them an opportunity. Mr. Piwowar, I'm going to ask for your quick thoughts on another SEC rule that has been considered, which is to require U.S. private companies to disclose more information as if they were public, but without any of the benefits of accessing the public markets. Do you have any concerns with that approach? Do you think it's the right approach? And how do you feel about it with respect to capital formation?
Yeah, I mean, I do have concerns. We obviously have a regime for public companies and a regime for private companies, and I worry about the unintended consequences from these. Right? Obviously, if you overburden public companies, you're going to have more private companies, and I worry about the fact that these companies will just go overseas, and then U.S. investors won't have access to the potentially great growing companies and the entrepreneurs of the future.
Yeah, well, I only have 30 seconds left. I don't know if I can get this out, but I have a similar concern with the ESG disclosures. And that I was talking to a friend of mine who works in the investment industry, and he said, look, this is a total giveaway to the private equity industry. Because what's going to happen is smaller companies who aren't going to be able to make or don't want to make those disclosures are going to have trouble making those disclosures. It's just going to be easier for them to sell. And so we'll see a wave of consolidation when I think we should be promoting more competition, more capital formation. Hope we have a hearing on that. Hopefully we can get Chair Gensler and others to come before our committee again. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Emmer.
Thank you, Chair Sherman and Ranking Member Huizenga. I was pleasantly surprised, and I'm proud to see my bill, the MayStreet Growth Act, noticed for this hearing. The MayStreet Growth Act would allow the Securities and Exchange Commission to provide for the creation of venture exchanges so that small and medium-cap companies can go public through a more streamlined process. This bill passed out of this committee unanimously in the 115th Congress, and it passed the House as well. In fact, I'd like to thank Chair Sherman, Mr. Scott, Mr. Himes, Mr. Foster, Mr. Meeks, Mr. Gottheimer, and Mr. Gonzalez on this subcommittee for voting in support of this bill, and I hope to have your support again. Look, we have a capital formation problem in this country, and ultimately the compliance burden borne by government overregulation is making the initial public offering process unrealistic for a large segment of private American companies. This hurts everyday American investors the most, much like Mr. Piwowar and Representative Gonzalez were just talking about. Small private companies that need capital are at a disadvantage today because the trading and listing environment is geared so much for much larger IPO companies than it was 25 years ago. How do we know? The participation in the IPO process has significantly declined since the 1990s. Let's look at the facts. The number of IPOs declined more than 63% from the 1990s to the 2000s and has stayed relatively flat up to 2020. At the same time, the United States has doubled the regulatory compliance costs a business has to take on for going public in a traditional IPO. Just to give an idea, it costs an average of $2.5 million for a company to achieve just the initial regulatory compliance for going public, and then it's an additional $1.5 million on an annual basis thereafter. These are SEC estimates. In the past 2 years, we've seen a surge in companies going public through alternative strategies like SPACs, indicating that the traditional IPO process is not feasible for emerging innovative companies. The small startup IPO should not be on the superhighway designed for trading Apple and Microsoft. We need to move away from the one-size-fits-all SEC regulatory posture and allow the market to try new, innovative strategies. After all, capital formation starts when a company can list its shares on a quality electronic venue plugged into the full force of America's investment potential. I appreciate my colleagues' willingness to advance legislation that creates new exchanges tailored to small and medium-cap companies because exchanges are integral in the capital formation process, and America's capital markets are the envy of the world. The broader discussion at this hearing, I worry, centers around making it harder for exchanges to operate, which could impose barriers on the new, small competitors in the venture exchange space and ultimately make our capital markets less competitive and accessible. When we set up structures that allow for more companies to go public, we give the American people more access to our capital markets. We give them more opportunities to build financial wealth. Mr. Piwowar, do you believe that our legislation, the MayStreet Growth Act, can eliminate some of the barriers currently deterring small, emerging growth companies from going public?
Thank you, Congressman. Yes, you pointed out the the streamlined IPO process, and so those are for existing private companies that do want to go public. In addition, as you point out, it also addresses the fact that the exchanges, the trading system is set up for the larger public companies, and frankly, the exchanges don't have the incentive to try to do innovative things, like you said, an experiment because of unlisted trading privileges. So in your bill, you would give exclusive trading rights to the venture exchange. Now, the commission looking at that, they're going to, it's going to be look at that very, very carefully, and we need to be very careful for that. The reason for that is you want to encourage the experimentation by the exchanges to compete with one another to make the market more conducive for that. And so it is my hope that would be the case. That you mentioned tick sizes and potentially doing call markets instead of continuous trading. But there's probably some other things the exchanges could do if they were granted that exclusivity.
Great point. And on that note, with a majority of American companies searching for alternative avenues from the traditional IPO process to form capital, such as SPACs, as I referred to earlier, or simply staying private, do you believe that there is a timely need for Congress to pass this legislation?
In a word, yes. Whatever you can do at Congress and the SEC can do to encourage more companies to go public at the appropriate time. You mentioned SPACs, right? Another one is direct public listings, and those are instances where you have companies that have grown very large in the private sector, and the only reason why they're going public is to have a liquidity event. They don't even need to raise capital at that point, so the more the better.
Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I'll now recognize the gentleman from Wisconsin, Mr. Stile.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. We've had a really interesting discussion today about the friction between exchanges, broker-dealers, investment banks, and asset managers on the liability question. And one of the things that I've been kind of pondering up here is have there been any instructive kind of global examples that we could look at outside the U.S. structure? In many ways, the U.S. capital markets are significantly stronger, bigger, and different than the global markets. But curious if that gives us any light into this conversation. And open up to you, if I can, Ms. Greene, for a quick comment on that. And then I'd like to come to you, Ms. Sukumar, as well, if you have a brief comment on that.
Sure. When we look at the markets, my understanding is, and we can certainly come back to you and confirm this, but the regulatory structure in the U.S. is unique in these special privileges that it does provide to the exchanges, things like immunity, rules-based liability caps, and even on the SEC plans that we see, the exclusion of the of industry members. So clearly things that can be improved here in this structure, and I would defer to Nandini on her views on how the global markets are structured here.
Thank you for that feedback. Ms. Sukumar, would you like to comment?
Yes, with pleasure. I would like to start perhaps by just saying that across the world, across our members, and we have 300 odd, this kind of regulatory immunity is standard. It is the standard model. And why is that? It's because the exchange, by nature, the nature of its work, the nature of its business, needs to do things, canceling trades, invoking, volatility mechanisms, all these kind of things. And these are often unpopular. So they need to be able to do it. They're a neutral, trusted third party that operates markets. So they need to be able to have regulatory immunity.
Only because we're subject to the time restriction. Appreciate that comment. So you see certain consistency in that.
Yes, absolutely.
Mr. Piwowar, Do you see that as well, or any comment you'd like to offer on that?
No further comment on
No
that.
further comment. Let me shift gears slightly, if I can, because I think we've had interesting conversations. I'd like to go to you, Mr. Piwowar, if I can. You commented in your testimony, in particular, an area that I have an interest in, that banning or restricting dual-class stocks would lead some companies to delist, I think was your testimony. I'm always concerned about proposals that reduce retail investors' options, especially when the purported benefits are questioned. And as you may know, the vast majority of Americans can't invest in many companies because they're not accredited investors under our U.S. rules and our U.S. structure. So we've essentially made a large number of promising investment opportunities off limits, but all to all but the rich, which seems a bit counterintuitive to me. We could get in the weeds if we had more time. But would any other bills attached to today's hearing lead to a reduction in the number of public companies, in your opinion?
I mean, I think anything that increases the burden on being a public company vis-a-vis a private company would, creates the incentives for either private companies to stay private or public companies to either go private or to simply move to other capital markets, right? I mean, what we forget is that there's not only a competition between the public markets and the private markets here, but Nandini's members are all competing to try to get listings around the world, and capital is truly global. So I worry about not only companies going private, but then also companies leaving the U.S. markets altogether.
Shifting more specifically to the accredited investor, do you think Congress should revisit the accredited investor standard?
Congress or the SEC has the ability to do it. They don't need additional authority, but I think potentially from this Oversight Committee's perspective, if you could direct the SEC to do something with that, to put the focus on it, I think that would be very helpful.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for holding today's hearing, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you for your brevity. I now recognize the ranking member for a 1-minute closing statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And yes, we are missing some briefings, and it's unfortunate that this was interrupted with votes. I appreciate the time, especially the additional time that all of the panelists have put forward. To kind of underscore my point from earlier, though, with all of the things that are going on, and Mr. Piwowar has highlighted as we talked about SEC actions, the SEC came out with another rulemaking today on SPACs. And it's like we can't even catch up to where we currently are or where they currently are. And the capacity and bandwidth of the SEC, much less everybody else who's being affected by all these things, is just getting stretched to the absolute limits. And we ought to be talking about that. Not that this isn't an important issue. Structures of markets is very important. It's what guarantees we've got the liquidity and the depth and makes this the premier place to invest in the world. But we are killing the goose that lays the golden egg here, in my opinion, and we've got to do better at tending to that. My time has expired. I yield back.
Recognize myself for a 1-minute closing statement, then the obligatory housekeeping. First, Mr. Piwowar, thank you for bringing to our attention that we may need legislation to provide for pilot studies by the SEC. The Republican side has constantly advocated to get poor and middle-class people the opportunity to make high-risk investments in low information securities. I would point out that the vast majority of middle-class and poor people's investments in the markets is through their interest in pension plans, plus, of course, mutual funds and business development companies. I thank Mr. Davidson, for an advocate of cryptocurrency, for explaining it to us clearly, that you ruin the whole purpose of cryptocurrency if you require them to adhere to anti-money laundering and know your customer rules. After all, cryptocurrency literally means hidden money, and if it can't be hidden money, why would anybody prefer it over the currency we have now? And finally, Ms. Sukumar, I thank you for bringing to my attention the fact that crypto exchanges call themselves exchanges, but aren't regulated exchanges. You can't call yourself a bank if you're not a bank. I'll ask you to comment for that for the record. My time has expired. I want to thank our witnesses for their testimony today. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded promptly to the witnesses for their response. I want to thank our witnesses in advance for knowing that they will respond promptly. Without objection, all members will be given 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. I remind members that written questions and materials for the record should be submitted to the email address which your offices have been apprised of. This hearing is adjourned.